Hey guys, and welcome to a quick video on hypercorrection. And we're going to emphasize that this isn't a good thing and it should be avoided. When's the last time you used the word whom? And do you even know how to use this word and when to use this word? I think we can all agree that whom is essentially disappearing from American English, with the exceptions of its use in a few fixed phrases, like to whom it may concern and to whom am I speaking. These phrases sound a little stiff. And apart from these two phrases, we don't really use whom that often. And that is because we're usually not very confident in how to use it. But I'll show you. And if you're in need of a refresher, who is a pronoun that belongs in the subject position, and whom is a pronoun that belongs in the object position. How do we know where the subject and object are? Well, the subject comes before the verb, and the object comes after the verb. That's all I need to say right now. We're going to talk more about subjects and objects in another video. But for now, that's all you need to know. So when people are speaking and writing, they don't always know whether whom is appearing in the object or the subject position. And therefore, they don't know when to use it and they don't feel confident with it. They haven't heard it very often because nobody's really using it anymore, and their intuition or their judgment of this sounds right or this doesn't sound right is not very strong. And so they end up misusing it. In fact, I might say just don't even use it at all because nobody's really using it anymore. However, let's look at a few examples. But what about Sir Isaac Newton, whom some contend was autistic? All right, is this the correct use of the word whom? And if you think it is, why? I'm not going to give you the answer right away. Let's look at another one. Whom shall I say is calling? This is different from to whom am I speaking? Whom shall I say is calling? And perhaps because we're used to saying, to whom am I speaking, do we think that whom belongs there in this sentence? Tell me what you think in the comments below. Now let's dissect these two examples. If you're not familiar with clauses, we're going to be learning more about them in another video, but I'm going to give you a crash course on them now so we can dissect this example. Listen closely, but if you feel lost, that's the point. The first part of the question, but what about Sir Isaac Newton, is a clause. We have a subject and a verb right there, and that is exactly what makes a clause. Now let's look at the second part of the question. Whom some contended was autistic. Notice how I've split up the rest of the question into two parts. So we have whom was autistic and some contended. Some contended is also a clause. Some meaning some people, which is a subject, and contend, which is a verb. So we have a subject and a verb, and that is exactly what makes a clause. So then we also have whom was autistic, which is another clause because it has a subject, the pronoun whom, and a verb was. So keep in mind that our example sentence in full is a question. But what about Sir Isaac Newton, whom some contend was autistic? And when we produce questions in English, we move a lot around and we make a lot of changes. So if we unscramble all of this and make it a statement, rather than a question, we would say, some contend Sir Isaac Newton was autistic. And in this sentence, we have the clause, some contend, and we have the second clause, Sir Isaac Newton was autistic. And to answer our at-large question, we're going to look at the second clause. When we make a question, we can use the pronouns who and whom to help construct those questions. But what do we do with whom was autistic? Remember our question? Should this be whom or who? We have to look at what the whom is representing. Whom is a pronoun, right? And pronouns substitute for nouns. So who is whom substituting for or representing in our question? If you look at the second clause, who or what is in the subject position? The answer is Sir Isaac Newton. So when we want to reference the subject of our sentence in a question, we need to use the pronoun that fits in the subject position. And if we're going to put a pronoun there to replace Sir Isaac Newton, should it be who or whom? Well, it should be who, because who belongs in the subject position and whom belongs in the object position. Thus, the correct word here should be who. Who was autistic? Now let's back up. When you read our original sentence on the last slide, did you think, oh, that whom doesn't belong there? Chances are you didn't have that intuition. I really didn't have that intuition either. It just sounds formal and fancy, but even I wasn't even sure if it was technically correct because I don't have that intuition. That same reasoning is what tells us that this example sentence is also incorrect. When we remove the question structure, or rather hypothetically answer the question, whom shall I say is calling, and I answer with Essie is calling, we find that Essie is in the subject position. So the pronoun we would use in the question also needs to be who, because it is referring to the subject of our sentence. The thing is, many people think whom sounds proper and fancy, so they might want to stick whom in questions like this, but the reality is they don't know the rules, so they do what is called hypercorrecting. They're trying to be really correct, and in doing so, they're actually making a mistake because they don't know the rules. So now let's talk about speech. We can distinguish between careful speech and casual speech. In careful speech, we're going to say words like don't, or do not, and won't, or will not. And in casual speech, we produce words like don't and won't. So we drop that final t sound. Now, most of us might say, well, we should use careful speech so we sound more articulate or proper. But in reality, most of us use casual speech. In fact, when someone does use careful speech, we're often caught off guard by it. I'm far more used to hearing someone say, I'm going to run to the store, than I'm going to run to the store. So the latter, the pronunciation of going to, can be a hypercorrection because it's not the efficient way to speak. We drop sounds like t from words like this because it allows us to speak quicker or more efficiently, and gonna accomplishes the same task as going to. It's really not that one form is better than the other. So should we articulate every sound, or can we just drop a sound? It's just there's no clear argument for why articulating every sound is better, when dropping the sound is the normal thing to do in speech. We also see hypercorrection in writing, especially in school, where everyone is trying to write very formally. So sometimes students create sentences that are not very clear or that sound like they're from another era. So I might try to write something hypothetically and produce a sentence like, if one were to buy the car, one would be in debt. However, if I were talking with someone like a friend, I would probably say, if you're going to buy the car, you're going to be in debt. So it's another way of saying the same thing, but in writing, we try to write in a way that sounds overly formal. And a lot of times, especially students, will reach really far to try and create that formal tone in their writing. So they'll produce sentences that almost don't make sense. And the teacher's thinking, why did they write it that way? Such as the example, they should comply, for if they do not, we are all going to pay the price. The use of for if they do not sounds really antique, right? Almost like something from a really old book or poem. And if that's the style of writing you're going for, then by all means, use it. I'm not saying what is correct and incorrect, but I am saying that most students hypercorrect their writing and forcefully apply expressions and styles like these to their writing in order to represent what they think is formal academic writing. Where instead the sentence, they should comply, but if they do not, we are all going to pay the price, accomplishes the same purpose. So sometimes people reach too far to hypercorrect their speech, and they do it without knowing the rules, which can lead to incorrect results, like using whom when we should use who. These attempts sound educated and informed, but they're incorrect usages. So who tends to do this? Who tends to hypercorrect? It's typically speakers of less prestigious language varieties, so people who might speak what isn't standard English. So the type of Englishes that people say doesn't sound like good English, if you know what I mean. So they hypercorrect because they're trying to produce language that is associated with high prestige varieties. So good sounding or educated sounding English. These are also often lower middle class individuals who are trying to sound more professional, trying to sound like they belong to a different socioeconomic class. It doesn't tend to be the working class or those in poverty, and it also doesn't tend to be the upper middle class and the super rich. They tend to speak however they want because they have nothing to prove. But what's even more interesting is that the lower middle class is hypercorrecting so they can sound like they belong to the upper middle class. But the reality is that whatever it is they're emulating, whatever it is they think that the upper middle class is doing, the upper middle class is usually not doing it. So what I'm saying is that hypercorrection is not really serving the purpose that it's intending to serve. With that said, as writers, writing requires us to try to embody new voices, new ways of articulating our thoughts. So we do have to go out of our comfort zone. We have to shoot for different language styles that we think are appropriate for these new domains that we find ourselves in, such as academia, the university, and whatnot. At the same time, if we overdo it, that could have, in many ways, negative consequences. Just as using extremely casual speech or slang when it shouldn't be used, like in professional writing, overdoing it and becoming hypercorrect and overly formal can have similar negative effects on how you're perceived as a writer or communicator. And that is the message of this video.